Welcome to the Infinite Surface podcast. Fat Stacks. Today we'll be looking at Jack Hamm's Drawing the Head and Figure and Cartooning the Head and Figure, two great books. But before we get into it, please take a minute and like the video and subscribe, and recommend it to a friend if you think that they'd like it as well. Now, both of these books are focused on cartooning in a way. This one says it's more about drawing, but I think by comparison to the books that we looked at before, anatomy books that are focused on structure and things like that, you could almost characterize both of these as focusing on simplification so much that they're almost both cartooning books. In fact, in the preface to this book, which is about drawing, Jack Hamm says, "It's hoped that by the simplified approaches in this book, the sincere student will see that good figure drawing is not impossible." Right. So most of what he's focusing on is a simplified approach. And you can see this kind of like standard cut the head in half, add the eyes, add these tick marks, divide up this is like the Loomis method minus the dimensionality, which makes it less effective, right? Because already you're thinking really two-dimensionally. And the Loomis method kind of encourages you to think in like more three-dimensional forms. So I think that this is useful to know. I mean, any artist that's drawing needs to know this, and it's in almost every book. But I don't know that it needs this much real estate. But this is the kind of stuff that Jack Hamm focuses on. But you can see right away that he gets all the way into it, right? Like these become really complicated breakdowns, and he gives really thorough descriptions of different kinds of eyes, different kinds of eyebrows, different kinds of lips, different kinds of chins, and things like this. So already it's becoming more and more and more specific, and he's getting more and more and more detailed about how to break down the form. And I love these super weird this is the five-eyed cube, as Robert Beverly Hale would call it. The width of the head is 5 eyes apart, and the depth of the cranium is 5 eyes deep. So that five-eyed cube is a really important measuring tool. And this is Jack Hamm's, kind of way of showing us how it is that the face breaks down in terms of eyeballs. And I love, it's just, they look like roaches or something. They're so weird in these drawings. But these kind of proportional breakdowns are really important. It's kind of, I think so many students just kind of come across this approach and they kind of leave it at that. And they just end up guessing around everything else and trying to learn, well, if the eyeball goes there, all I need to do is just draw an eyeball in that spot. And I think, becoming more and more aware of these kind of proportional breakdowns and how they relate to different kinds of faces, super important. And you can see here, this is where he's really focusing in on line work, right? Like using the side of the tool, making just one or two kind of really beautifully efficient marks. And I think this is really important, right? And when we get to looking at Arthur Guptill's books later on, we'll start to see books that really focus in on that kind of mark making. And even Loomis's book, to an extent, talks a little bit about that. But it's a really good thing to kind of remind ourselves of, which is just like, simplicity like this can really help us, even if we're trying to get different kinds of breakdowns of different kinds of eyes. So here we get right into an anatomical breakdown of the eyes and the lips and things like that. Really helpful things. And then all these breakdowns of different kinds of noses, plus the anatomy of the nose. This is why this book is good, right? Because it's kind of starts you with like a tip and a trick, but really quickly moves you into like more specific anatomy, more specific profile observation, even something like this where you start to see the ear dimensionally, right? And this is something that I feel like students struggle with, is the ear from the back view, like getting this kind of dimensional S shape going. And right here, he's kind of laying that out for you already. Brings you into problem solving, how to solve the problem of hair with different kinds of line works. Of course, just like anybody else, talking about grouping the hair into big shapes, drawing dark hair versus light hair, et cetera, even having different kind of textures, different kinds of papers, things like that. So it's really, really, really useful. These kind of diagrams always super helpful to understand how the skeletal structure relates. So you can see it's getting into the territory of like a proper drawing book, a proper anatomy book, something that's pretty specific and can really help you understand thoroughly how to approach a figure. And I just think that his examples are excellent. I think that they're really simple, as he claims, and I think that they're really good. Now, Loomis does have a book like this. He has a book called Fun with a Pencil, and he also has Successful Drawing. Now, Successful Drawing is a much more technical book, and Fun with a Pencil is more like this, right? So Fun with a Pencil is more about cartooning and ways to kind of like make shapes that are fun and active and live. But here you see he's starting to get into kind of mannequinization, or how to like set up poses. Here, just kind of contrapposto, something like that. And here you see proportional breakdowns and little diagrams for how to set up a female figure with these two opposing triangles. In some ways, this is kind of like a more rigid Riley method, and very useful, if you kind of get a handle on these things and learn how to diversify and make unique observations, but still use these kind of techniques. I think it's really useful. This is a great section on how to observe and make use of the contour with the principle of the T, as he calls it, which is, and you can see like different kinds of T's here. And this, I talk to my students about this all the time, which is like, don't make your way down a contour too far before you start to get intersections and overlaps. And anytime you can perceive an intersection and overlap, make sure to make a note of it on your contour. You want to make sure that you have as many of these T and P and V shapes as you can, because they indicate so much about a volumetric form that if you leave them out, you're really missing quite a bit. So as we go on, we see into the pelvis, quite thorough examination. I still think that Loomis's book, Fun with a Pencil, is probably a little bit more thorough, but this is a great book. I think it's definitely a worthy book to have in the collection. I normally don't recommend it as something that you would have as like your primary figure drawing book. I just don't think it's in depth in any like kind of structural sense. And I'm so big on structure, right? So I think that that's such an important part of figure drawing and drawing from observation, is that interpreting what you see into structures. He does that a bit, but it's more with this kind of like rendered style, which is fine. I mean, it's still quite simple, still quite useful. I think that you can see that better, and you can conceptualize that better in a book like Michael Hampton's, where the structures are just more clear and more diagrammatic. But great simplifications of the hand, great proportional breakdowns. And I love this section where he's just talking about how to show the hand in its most active state as much as possible. I just really appreciate all of that. And this part is great, right? Like where he really gets down into things like the elbows and the knees, and even discusses with you. And these little parts are really worth reading. They're really elegant descriptions of what's going on. And so I know that students all the time, and anybody, me too, all the time, struggle with things like knees. And you can get the hang of them if you kind of know the terrain, and seeing this kind of diagram with this kind of thing, with this kind of thing next to it, this 1, 2, 3, this 1, 2, 3, all of these things next to each other are really, really, really useful to have. And so, if you have this book, making these drawings, kind of making these relationships in your head, that, very, very priceless thing. These kind of proportional things, we'll see these in Richet and other books like that, where they lay out these proportions. So these are not entirely unique, but nothing that is in any of these books really seems to be very entirely unique. They're all just kind of building off of each other and creating versions of each other. I like this part especially, and I think that a lot of people emphasize the idea that if you want to get good at drawing feet, you should get good at drawing shoes. I think shoes are really fun to draw and really difficult. So here's a great section on fabric and how light affects it and all this kind of stuff. So it's a really great book. I think it's really worth having. And let's take a briefer look at the cartooning book, which I guess I find a little bit less interesting. I guess it's just my own bias, but here I find that these simplifications are just like less useful for me. It's just my style of working, but these kind of layouts, like these kind of initial intuitive ways of laying out the face are quite useful to setting up and kind of establishing something quick and early, especially if you're an illustrator. So having these kind of in your pocket, being able to understand and just this kind of diagrammatic breakdown of different haircuts and things like that, it's just a wonderfully handy tool to have around. Not all of the solutions are so elegant. I don't know that this is the most beautiful drawing of hair, and I find some of the solutions in the other book just a little bit more interesting, but I guess they're for a different audience, right? So I don't know that these are necessarily for kids, but they're definitely under the rubric of cartooning. And I'm a comics lover. I've read comics my whole life, and I still do. But this is, most of these are kind of in a style like this is not a style that I'm super interested in. But even still, having the kind of knowledge of how to stretch a face around like that, it's really important stuff, And I think this is something that I could use to study more. Especially, I think a lot of my drawings tend to be a bit deadpan. Which is fine, because I think that I try to activate the drawing in different ways without big expressions or without big gestures or anything like that. So my drawings tend to not be so super heroic or anything like that. But it's really useful to be able to push in that direction if you want to. And this is a great book for that. So this is Jack Hamm. We won't go all the way through this one, but here too, I wanted to take a moment to notice this. Super useful, because everybody struggles with these areas so much, and there's a more in-depth section on it in this book, in the fabric section, where he really looks into how these clothing folds work and how to kind of think about them and draw them and what direction they come from and where they pull from. Here it's simplified down, right? So I think both of these are really excellent kind of entry points to that kind of information. So this is Jack Hamm, cartooning the head and figure and drawing the head and figure. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching. I hope you liked the video and found it useful. And if you did like it and found it useful, I hope that you like the video and subscribe. And please pass it on to a friend if you think that they'd find it useful, and maybe they'll subscribe too, so that everybody can be updated about new content coming up. I'm going to be reviewing a lot more books and having a lot more artist interviews and conversations about topics relevant to the arts. So please do subscribe, and I'll see you next time on Infinite Surface Podcast.